So far in this chapter, I've walked you through all the steps of using MySQL and PHP to create the CRUD necessary to edit the subjects that are in our database. So now we need to do the same thing, but we need to do it for the pages. So what I have in mind here is that for the pages, we'll have a display of what the page looks like first, and we've already got that. But below it, we'll have a link that says, edit this page. And then we'll be able to click that link, and it'll take us to edit_page.php. And then we would also, of course, have to have the ability to click on a subject and be able to add a page to the subject. And we can even pull up a list of all the pages that are in a subject. We know how to do all of that. Instead of walking you through all of this, though, I'm going to trust that you now know enough and have enough examples at your disposal from the subjects that we created that you can create this entire part yourself. Refer back to what I did for editing the subjects, for creating it. Remember what we talked about for each of those things and the steps to go through. And before I set you off on your own, I'm just going to give you a couple of reminders about some of the things that we've covered. So far, we've seen 10 MySQL commands. Let's go over those again and remember how we used them. We had MySQL connect, and that connected to our database. Now, we don't want to forget about it, even though we've put it in that includes file that we're going to require every time we bring up a page to connect to the database. Same thing with MySQL select database. We're going to do that each and every time. Even if we don't actually have to type it, it's taking place. And then we have MySQL query, probably the most common MySQL command that we're going to use. And MySQL error whenever things go wrong. MySQL close will go at the end of the process. And together, those make up the basic 5 ways of interacting with the database. But there are 5 more that are going to come up from time to time. We have MySQL fetch array when we want to pull information out of the query and we're doing a read. We know how to do that. We can ask how many rows did you get back, and that's going to be useful when we're not interested so much in what the data is, but how many rows are there. And we can use it to verify what we got back, but we can also use it like the counter that we did when we had the position pull down. And then we have MySQL affected rows, and that's going to come into play especially for update and delete, when it'll tell us how many rows were just affected, and we can test that. Let's not mistake that it's not a MySQL command. There's MySQL _real_escape_string, and that was that wonderful command that's going to help put everything into good shape to go into our MySQL database. And we wrapped it in that nice function that checks whether or not magic quotes is on, but it's still a MySQL command. And last, there's one that we haven't actually used yet, but I want to tell you about in case you need it, and it's MySQL _insert_ID. And that's in the case in which we insert a record. We can call this and find out what ID did it just get, because when we're inserting it, most of the time we're letting the database auto-increment to the next ID, and we don't know what that ID will be. MySQL insert ID is a great way to just reach back across that connection in the same way that affected rows does and say, by the way, what was that ID that you just assigned to that insert I gave you? So that may end up becoming of use to you at some point, and I want to make sure you see it. There are probably another 10 or 15 MySQL commands that you can look up on php.net, but these are the essential 10 that you're really going to want to work with most of the time. So really focus on learning these 10, make sure you have an understanding of them, and make sure you understand the way in which you use them while you're developing the pageCRUD. I also want to go back over some of the pitfalls with you because we've come across a few more since we last visited that list. In addition to the first 3, which we already looked at, we also came across the headers already sent error. And we talked about output buffering and how we can either turn that on or off or manually turn it on and off. The important thing to remember is that headers have to be sent before HTML is sent unless we have output buffering helping us out. And then number 5 is encoding values. The input, the output, and we saw how to do that. We spent some time with URL encoding, and we saw especially how that was important when we were constructing URLs and making GET requests. Number 6 is form validation, and this is largely up to us to create, but it is one of the pitfalls because we do want to make sure that our form data is going to be suitable for the database that we've built. We can't put something that is 100 characters long into a field that we told MySQL should only be 50 characters long. So it's up to us to know what our database looks like, know what kind of data we want to be allowed to put in there, and develop good form validation. And then there's SQL escape character handling. And we talked about how that real escape function can help us. And I helped you to write a function that can hopefully get all of those characters escaped if we remember to use it each and every time. But it's one of the pitfalls because it causes a lot of headaches for developers. And last of all is badly crafted SQL. And we saw a couple of examples of how that could happen. One of the ways it can happen is by not having good values that have been validated by our forms, or not having things that have been escaped. But we also could have just made typos or mistakes ourselves that caused the SQL not to work. And we saw a few techniques for how we can peek and see what that SQL command was and try and find out what went wrong with it. As a fallback, we can always go to phpMyAdmin and look at the SQL that it generates when it does its commands. And the last thing I want you to pay careful attention to as you're developing your pages are ways that you can refactor your code. Now, you can refactor your code almost endlessly, but there is a certain sweet spot between generality and specificity where we create functions that are going to be helpful to us and move them over to our functions files and get them out of our main code. And we talked about a few spots like outputting a list of errors that might make good functions, or our form validation. So go ahead and do that. Put those into other files. Feel free to make other include files. Maybe you have form functions and general functions or something like that. And then notice also that when we did our edit subject, that we created a form here, and the bulk of this form is actually repeated by create subject. There's no reason that create subject and edit subject can't share the same form with only a few modifications to it, if at all. So take a look at that and see if you can break that out into a separate file that we also include. Maybe you'll call it just subject form, and both files can include the subject form at the appropriate place. Try and refactor your code, try and improve it, but most of all, make sure you understand how the CRUD is working and how we're interacting with PHP and the database. Go ahead, spend some time with it, and when you feel that you've got something that works and you understand what's going on, meet me in the next movie. I'll briefly show you what I came up with, and then we'll move on to the next big piece, which will be completing the public area and the public side of this content management system.